According to the attitude justification hypothesis, individuals inflate the normative appropriateness or how virtuous open-mindedness is perceived to be when it is likely to reinforce their personal attitudinal convictions, but devalue the normative appropriateness or virtuousness of open-mindedness when it is likely to contradict these convictions. Paradoxically, then, according to the attitude justification hypothesis, open-mindedness can be biased, as I think will become apparent in a few moments. It's important to recognize that the attitude justification hypothesis and the tenable message hypothesis are not the same thing. Let me first describe in more general terms the tenable message hypothesis, just to remind you. Individuals, according to this hypothesis, adhere to conventional norms, that is, socially shared values, when assessing whether it's appropriate to be open or closed-minded in a situation. That is, an untenable message violates socially shared norms or values. The attitude justification hypothesis, however, says perceptions of normative appropriateness also can serve to justify the individual's pre-existing personal attitudinal convictions, their personal ideological orientation. Here we have some examples that highlight the distinction between the tenable message hypothesis and the attitude justification hypothesis. Let's look at the tenable message hypothesis. Here, a closed-minded reaction is perceived to be appropriate when listening to a message, let's say, advocating ethnic cleansing. In this case, one would argue one perhaps should refuse to openly consider this reprehensible message. But people would say it's appropriate to be open-minded when listening to a message, let's say, advocating healthy dietary practices. The message itself is either violating mainstream values or not. In contrast, let's look at the attitude justification hypothesis. An example of this would entail a conservative individual might believe it's appropriate to be open-minded when listening to a conservative message. However, a liberal individual may be less likely to believe it's appropriate to be open-minded when listening to the very same conservative message. So this has to do with personal attitudinal convictions, not normatively accepted and socially shared values. The attitude justification hypothesis, as I've suggested before, can produce a kind of biased open-mindedness effect, and in particular within the realm of political ideology. Specifically, when an individual rates politicians from the other side, from the opposing party or ideology, they will rate an open-minded politician as being high in normative appropriateness, extremely virtuous, and rate a closed-minded politician as low in normative appropriateness, as lacking in virtue. That is, individuals, when listening to someone from the other side, the opposing ideological camp, will prefer an open-minded politician to a closed-minded politician in the domain of politics. But let's consider what happens when an individual is listening to a politician from their own side, their own party and ideology. Here we predict that this effect is less likely to emerge. They're less likely to say the open-minded cognition is far superior, more appropriate, or virtuous than a closed-minded politician who is terrible and lacking in appropriateness or virtuousness. Why? Why do we expect that this effect will be reduced or perhaps even reversed? Well, basically, if a politician's on my side, I might think it's normatively appropriate for that politician to dogmatically adhere and defend my position. So I tolerate dogmatism from people on my side, but I don't tolerate dogmatism from people on the other side. We performed an experiment to try to demonstrate this effect. In this experiment, participants in the role of perceivers read about information describing a political candidate who's in the role of target person. If you're familiar with the impression formation, we talk about the perceiver and the target person who is the object of perception. We selected for the experiment participants only those who were either liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans. We didn't have any middle-of-the-road people in this experiment. We also varied the politician's characteristics. So in the congruent condition, the politician's on the same side as the participant, whereas in the incongruent condition, the politician is on the opposing side when compared to the participant. We also varied the politician's style of communication. In one condition, the politician's style of communication and rhetoric was described as being open-minded. Okay, so the politician was described as someone who would listen to other viewpoints and consider viewpoints on the other side and so on. In the other condition, the politician was described as being extremely close-minded and dogmatic and tenaciously sticking to a particular position, refusing to consider opposing viewpoints and so on. Okay, after reading about the candidate, participants rated the degree to which the politician's approach was normatively appropriate, virtuous, if you will. They also rated the degree to which they liked the politician, and they also rated the likelihood that they would vote for the politician. Our results supported the attitude justification hypothesis. When the participant viewed a politician on the other side, they preferred the candidate or the politician when the politician was open-minded to closed-minded. That is, they viewed an open-minded politician as more appropriate, more virtuous. They liked him more and were more likely to vote for him than if he was closed-minded. In the congruent politician condition or congruent candidate condition, this effect vanished. Ratings of the open and closed-minded candidate were essentially the same. They no longer said they preferred the open-minded politician over the closed-minded politician. Why? Well, being closed-minded was tolerated, and therefore there was less of a tendency to favor the open-minded politician over the closed-minded politician. Let's take a look at these results. Here we have the preference for open-mindedness effect, which shows the magnitude of the difference between the open-minded condition and the closed-minded condition for each of the ratings. The simplest way to understand this particular graph is that high bars mean that the open politician was preferred to the closed politician. This is the difference score. Whereas short bars that approach zero mean that the open politician and closed politician were rated approximately equally. Let's look at the left side of this picture. These are the normative appropriateness, or if you will, virtuous ratings. How normatively appropriate or virtuous did they perceive the politician to be? That blue bar tells you that when faced with an incongruent candidate, that is, when perceiving a candidate who was on the other side, they clearly preferred the open-minded politician to the closed-minded politician, and therefore the blue bar is high and large. The orange bar, however, approaches zero. Essentially, the effect disappeared when participants were rating the congruent candidate, the candidate on their own side. Why did this occur? Because the closed-minded candidate was no longer viewed as so inappropriate anymore, and therefore was viewed about just as appropriate as an open-minded candidate. We replicated this same pattern for the vote likelihood ratings and also for the liking ratings, right? If the candidate's on the other side, we prefer an open-minded candidate to a closed-minded candidate. But when they're on our side, this effect kind of goes away. It's kind of okay if you're closed-minded. You're rated about just as well as someone who's open-minded if they're on your own side. Essentially, what does this say? This says that closed-mindedness is not a sin when it comes from people of your own political ideology or party. In conclusion, perceptions of the normative appropriateness or virtuousness of open-mindedness serve at least in part to justify or promote the individual's personal attitudinal convictions. That is to say, paradoxically, open-mindedness can itself be biased. These findings have important political implications. Liberal Democrats often complain about inappropriate closed-mindedness and arrogance in conservative Republican politicians. Conservative Republicans often complain about the same sorts of traits in liberal Democratic politicians, and these criticisms may be legitimate in some cases, But we have to worry about these criticisms. That is, sometimes they may not be entirely objective. Sometimes people may be criticized for being closed-minded or viewed positively for being open-minded, not because they actually are that way, but because this serves to justify our personal attitudinal convictions.